Hi, I'm Judy Wilcox. I'm George's wife, and I'm here to introduce you to this part of our video. This is Hood House Memories. We are all here, the family is all here, except for Carol, who will be joining us by video later on. Have done part one, which is a true factual part of the video. This is part two, which is just memories of this house and good times that we've had here.
I'm Lola Wilcox, married to Chuck Wilcox. We're here on this occasion not only to make videos, but it's the occasion of our 50th wedding anniversary. We chose to have it here. There's a family reunion going on connected to that, and the videoing that we're doing. And so there may be children, dogs, all kinds of other people wandering through whenever they want, and we'll just video that right along with everything else. We are able to be in this house this weekend for these events because after Nancy and George and Clara, all these people passed or went on to a different life in Kansas again, what happened was that Debbie Chastain bought this house. She turned it into a bed and breakfast, and then it went through a couple of evolutions and is now owned by Carol, who loves to have us come and stay here and do these kinds of events. So it's now called the Hood House. When we knew it, it was the Friar House.
My name is Chuck Wilcox, and I grew up here in Saratoga. I never lived here in the Friar House. That's what it was called when we were kids, the Friar House. I lived just 2 blocks from here on 2nd and Farm with my mother and her second husband. My own father, Keith, and Clara actually refused to have Frank adopt me, and they had to pay child support, which came every month. But it was kind of common knowledge, even I understood this from a boy, that most of the payments were generated by Clara and George. Clara kept meticulous accounts of every penny that was spent on me as a young boy. And I was welcome here at the Friar House. Even in later years, I had a room that I could sleep in that was designated as mine. Clara and Dorotha had sort of a amenable relationship, slightly disrespect for each other, but for my sake, they put up with each other. And Frank had no relationship with Clara at all, but he did have a relationship with George. George and Frank got along very well behind the ladies' backs, of course, and they had the opportunity of getting together any number of times when the women weren't around. And Frank Sr. and Frank Jr., my younger brother on Frank's side, had a very good relationship too when the women weren't around. And for the end, George actually came to visit Frank, and they had an extended conversation a number of times.
While Mom was finishing her 4-year degree over all those summers for such a long time, I would go with her and stay with Grandpa and Grandma in Saratoga for a couple of weeks. And oftentimes, I would stay extra weeks. Then, before time for our school to start back in Kansas, Grandpa and Grandma would load me back up in the car, and Mom and Dad would bring George and Vicki, and we would all meet at Johnson's Corner outside of Denver. that's the closest they could get to halfway. And as kids, we just loved it because we got to play the music on the jukebox selectors at the booths, and we got to eat those great hamburgers and milkshakes, and those cinnamon rolls were to die for. So it was always a great trip. I know that the reason that Mom and Dad had me sit in the front seat whenever we went on family vacations was because of my motion sickness. I know that it probably wasn't easy for George and Vicki because maybe I wasn't so gracious about it either, but that was kind of like the seat of honor. But really the reason was that we didn't want to end up having to be in a car with somebody that had been sick and had to smell that all the way. Well, with that in mind, I remember one particular time that it was time to go back to Kansas, and Grandma got me up early that morning and fed me bacon and eggs and orange juice. And then they loaded me up and put me in the back seat of the black sedan. That was a big mistake. I probably should have never had that kind of breakfast. It wasn't a good combination. We started down the road that went around the range instead of over the range. And that road could be bumpy still at times, but at least I think Grandpa thought it wasn't so up and down and maybe a little bit faster. It wasn't a very busy road. We even saw them herding sheep across the road at one point and had to wait for them to clear the road. But I could tell that I was going to have problems with that trip. And as we went just for a little bit further, I asked Grandpa if he could stop the car so I could get out because I thought I might be sick. Well, he didn't stop the car soon enough, and I did get sick. And so then, because of course nobody could stand the smell of that all the way to Johnson Corner, Grandma got me out of the car, pulled my suitcase out of the trunk, and made me change clothes right there at the back of the car. It was horrible. Here I am standing in my underwear outside the car, and you'd think, well, nobody's coming by. 2 cars came by. What was that? And so the result was that I had one of the most embarrassing moments of my life up to that time, but I understand totally why we had to do it.
Hartnett. I'm the youngest child, so I have a perception of what this all means to us, probably different than my oldest brother and then George and Carol. We came here every summer. Right after school was out, we would all hop in the car and drive up to Saratoga. And we had such wonderful times here when we were little. My grandmother Clara, she didn't seem to be very tolerant of all of us when we'd come. She liked Carol the best. She was the oldest girl grandchild, and George, Richard, and I were somewhat tolerated, but we felt like we got some extra attention from Grandpa. Grandpa Fryer was my only grandfather that I knew. My mother's father died the year I was born. My my father's father died when he was probably 4, and then she married Grandpa Fryer after that, and so he was always here. And there were times later in his life when he would say, "Oh, I don't really belong," and I said, "Oh yes, you belong to me, because you're the only grandfather I ever had." So we would come up in differing combinations of people. Carol would come a lot by herself, or would get to stay by herself, and George and I would come, and Daddy and Grandpa, there was always this underlying friction, but they got along most of the time, and it was just a great thing for little kids. And as we got older, over here is where the lilac bush was, and we would always have to have all of our pictures. You know how people have family pictures? We would have to have our family pictures taken every time we were here in front of the lilacs, and they were always in bloom because we were usually here in May. But this is a great place. Lots of good memories.
Okay, my name is George Wilcox. I was named after George Fryer, and I spent most of my life when we came to the house being called either Little George or George Richard. It was the only place I had those added designations, but we had to have a way to tell me from Grandpa, I guess. As we stay in this house this weekend, it's amazing to me how much has changed and how much has remained the same. I think like Vicki about the lilac bushes, they were actually on both sides of the porch, and they were almost as tall as the porch. They were amazing bushes. The enclosed porch is really a remarkable piece of architecture. I always loved that porch and loved to go out even as a child and sit on the porch and kind of look around. I look at the fence that's behind and wraps around the lot. It's the same fence that was always there for years and years and years. The lawn looks a little better than it did back then, but I remember getting the opportunity to mow it with an old push mower, which at the time I was small enough it was hard to get it going, but once you got it going, it did a good job and really a nice job of cutting. This is a great old house, and like I say, it's very strange to go in and see different furniture, which I guess should be expected since much of the furniture is in my house now. But you know, the piano used to sit there, and my understanding is that Grandma and Grandpa bought the house inclusive of the furniture. So some of it was really never theirs either. There are so many great features in the house, and you know, minor changes that have been made, but for the most part, it's still the same house. We have many of the same light fixtures, and yeah, the woodwork's all been painted now, which the story was they used to every year or two revarnish all the inside woodwork, and it just got darker and darker and darker as the years went by. But it was beautiful woodwork, and it still is, even with the paint, but the varnish was nice. But it's an impressive house. Not as big as it seemed when I was young, but I guess that's part of getting old. But it's refreshing to spend a weekend here again and just see how the town has changed and how it's remained the same. Much of it is the same as it was 50 years ago. That's all I have to say.
I only remember one Christmas that Grandpa and Grandma didn't come to Liberal, but we came up to Saratoga instead. We brought Grandma Summers with us so that we could go see Buddy and Lander and all of that. But it was an exciting time for all of us to get to see the snow and experience the cold differently than we did in Liberal. That was my first year to get a camera, and I brought it along, and I know that we even got to go up on part of the range. I don't know how far we went. I didn't even know that was possible, but I have pictures of snow higher than the car, and so it was a great time of great memories. One of the best memories that I have of that time was when Chuck brought his guitar and came over to have a time of fun together, and he played his guitar, and Vicki and I just thought it was wonderful because we had this cute older brother that was talented and could sing, and he played songs, And I don't, you know, he must have been a senior in high school or early college, but it was dreamy.
Long before the time of blended families being so prevalent in our society, we had our brother that lived up here. And we always thought that he was so lucky to live up here. And we lived down in Kansas. And he would come to see us sometimes. Clara would bring him, and it was never really long enough, but he was our big brother. And Carol and I had the biggest crush on him when he was young. When he was in high school, he came flying through Liberal for some reason. I don't know where. He was going back east or something. And Grandma was there, and after he got on the plane, I looked dreamy-eyed at her and I said, "Oh, Grandma, he's so handsome." And he was. But she thought that was so funny that she told everybody for the next couple years that I thought he was so handsome. At least that's how it seemed to me. So, Carol liked him too, but he's always been good with me.
So, working on this little project with family history and trying to put down for posterity, since we're the only ones that remember any of this, has really brought us much closer as a family and as a group. But there were many years when we didn't communicate at all, but we feel like we're all fairly close now. I remember a lot of times, well, Chuck was up here and he was an actor and he looked like an actor. He looked fantastic. You know, we were all fat, dumpy little kids from Kansas. And Chuck just, you know, had the square jawline, and he was fabulous. And I remember specifically going to one play when we were young that Chuck was in. It was in Laramie at some kind of steakhouse or something. I think it was called The Virginian. There was a movie made of it later on. And the line I remember the best out of that was when he yelled at some other guy on stage that, "Smile when you say that to me." And then he shot him, I think. I don't But, you know, that was very impressive to me. And as I recall, then the cast broke up and laughed themselves. It was really quite a scene, but it is etched in my memory, and as my memory fades, maybe that won't, I don't know. But it was, you know, we went several places and saw, you know, things that Chuck and Lola were doing, but they were enough older than we were as little children that Chuck was an adult and we were still kids. So, you know, a lot of times I think he had a little trouble relating to us since he only saw us about once a year anyway. But now that we're all a little bit older than then, we're all much closer than we were actually growing up. But it's amusing. What we had to wait for was the generation ahead of us to kind of get out of the way.
I agree with George basically, understanding that as adults, all of us have gotten together a lot more and have gotten to know each other a lot better, as adults especially. And when we look back on these times, we realize that we were being extremely naive. And we're happy now that we have managed to overcome that and become good friends.
Grandma was always looking for projects to entertain us while we came to visit. Grandpa would take us on long rides to see antelope, and we went up on Kennedy Peak, and we took picnics up in the mountains and all kinds of things like that. But we also went to the library in Saratoga, just a little tiny place, but we found some books to read. And then she taught me how to embroider. And Vicki had some embroidery projects too, but I never had the patience to learn how to crochet. So whenever I had to do the finishing work on the borders and the hems, Grandma always had to do that for me. I know that Grandma used to crochet and embroider and do all kinds of stuff like that all year long because she belonged to the Ladies' Aid Society. And once a year in the summertime, they would get together at somebody's ranch, and she'd load me up in the car, and we'd go out to this big luncheon meeting, and they'd have this auction and sell their goods, and then they'd use them for certain projects that they had. And I just thought that was great fun to get to go along with Grandma with all the grown-up ladies and get to hear all their gossip and chatter and see what was going on. And it was fun to get to see what Grandma made for those particular projects and how people just bought them up so that they could have some kind of personally made item. One summer, we also went to the store and bought a pattern to make a craft apron, in which you would sew these little individual small spaces where you could put crayons, so every crayon had an individual slot. And she showed me how to use her pedal sewing machine, and I made an apron for Vicki and an apron for me, and I took those home to Kansas, and I thought I was really hot stuff.
When we'd come in the summer on our vacation, Grandma would always find things for us to do, and there were always things that were here that we liked to do. That Grandma and Grandpa had was a little cafe set, and the meals were all flat disc that was painted like a roast beef dinner. And I had plastic plates, and we'd pull all of these things out, and Grandpa would sit in his chair, and Dad would sit over here, and I would be the Fay lady. And that was because it was a cafe, so I ran my own cafe here. And I would put the little aluminum things on and serve it. And Grandpa always gave me a tip, and it was always a dime. It never got any more, but it was really something. And I think somewhere I inherited that little Fay lady set, but he just got the biggest kick out of that.
And you still kept a dime, right?
And I still kept the dime. It's the only bit of money I ever had that I kept. Oh, Grandma too would keep the ends of her bread loaves when she was, through the months before we came, and she would let them dry out, and then she would make them into little pieces. And in the first day that we got here, we would grab that bag of hardened bread and take it out to the river, always to the same place, and feed the ducks.
I remember the closet full of toys, which included the Fay Lady set, but it also included a Viewmaster with little cartridges from probably the 40s and 50s that we used to enjoy a great deal. There was a case about this long full of Viewmaster slides that we would look at, and we didn't have a Viewmaster at home, so it was something that we used to occasionally fight over as to who got to watch it now. So it was kind of fun, but there were, as we got older, there were more options. I remember that Grandma and Grandpa used to play cribbage every night. They would set up the card table over in that section of the house, and they would play best 2 out of 3 every night and keep track of points for a penny a point on cribbage. And I think Grandma owed Grandpa like millions of dollars, but they played every night and they got along. It was cute how they, that was their one activity every night. And then Grandma would come into her chair and she would do her needlework and crocheting, and Grandpa would go to his chair and smoke his Tipperillos and watch all the goings on around him.
At least one time when I came up, my grandmother got me a cowboy hat and a scarf that I could wear. And I had brought that up the next summer, and she bought me some cowgirl boots. Now this was just wow to me, cowgirl boots. And we went out to the roundup and watched them brand some of the cattle and things like that I wasn't sure how I felt about. But I wore my boots, and on the way back into town, Grandpa took me by the Rustic. And I, of course, had never been in the Rustic, so I didn't really know what it was. I still thought he was going to see a man about a dog and never saw the dog. But he took me, and I stood right by the barroom doors that would open up, and everybody in the place just howled when they saw me, because here I was with my little hat and my little scarf and then my boots that I had to model for everybody. But I was right there in the doorway, and he said, "Don't you tell your grandma, because she'll skin me alive."
Some of my other summer memories relate to having George and Vicki there with me. And the first thing that Grandma would do when Vicki and I both came at the same time is she would take us to the beauty shop and she would get a perm in both of our hair. I think that it was easier somehow to take care of our hair if she didn't have to worry about fixing it. I remember summers with pin curls. Not a good thing. But anyway, we would go around with those curly tops, and it was easier for her to keep track of two girls' hair and keeping us looking halfway decent. One of my memories of going to the beauty shop without Vicki on one of my summers there is that I was exposed to the world of romance magazines. And that I had never seen anything like that in my life. Of course, my mom would have never bought a magazine like that, and Grandma wouldn't have either, but it was sitting there on the table while people waited to get their hair done. And so I was sitting there and I started reading this. It's like a romance novel, only it was in a magazine. Wow, I never even knew people wrote stuff like that. And here I was sitting there reading these stories, and I even talked Grandma into asking if I could take it home so I could finish the story one time. I think she would have died if she'd known what I was reading. But there my young eyes were open to the world of semi-adult literature. When George and Vicki would be there, one of the things that Grandpa would do in his entertainment exercises is he would give us, all three of us, a 50-cent piece. And then he would take us down to the country store on the corner on Main Street. And he would let us spend it on penny candy and 5-cent candy. And we would just have a wonderful time spending every bit of that 50 cents and enjoying eating it afterwards. And then the final thing that I think of in relationship to this has to do with drinking soda. You know, we do that so much in our lives today that's just kind of a common thing. But back then, soda came in these small bottles. And Grandma would go and buy a set of Coke, and they didn't have diet drinks back in those days. And then we would go to the corner drugstore across the street from the country store, and she would buy cherry syrup. And then she would take it home and she would make her cherry Coke. And that was her great indulgence when I was there, for us to be able to enjoy.
Another thing we always did every year when we came to Saratoga was Grandpa would give us either a 50-cent piece or a silver dollar, and we would go down to the drugstore where they had racks and racks of jars full of penny candy, and you could pick out your candy, and we used to leave with little sacks full of candy. The strangest, most exotic, bizarre candies you ever saw. Like watermelon slices and bit o' honey and ancient candies that don't exist anymore. But we would always spend that silver dollar down to nothing in the candy store. Kind of wish I had the silver dollars now.
So my favorite toy at this house was a tube full of Lincoln Logs. I got to build all sorts of cabins from the models, of course, that were in the instructions. But I got to build the Lincoln Logs. And I like that toy so much that I've made sure my own grandchildren have sets of Lincoln Logs as well. And the piano was right here in this room. I know I would bang away and play all the things that kids play, that is running their hands up and down the keyboard. And eventually she took over piano lessons for me and paid for piano lessons for years. I don't know exactly how many years, but I got so I could play little tunes. Then eventually, when I got into high school, I played things like Claire Balloon and Scarlatti and that sort of serious music, so that I became, to Grandma's delight of course, I became a music major at college.
Of course, our main method of transportation when we were in Saratoga was Chickadee. And we would ride in that pickup everywhere and anywhere. Grandpa would take us with Grandma up for picnics up on the range. And we'd spread a blanket in the back end, and sometimes I'd sit in the front, but most of the time I sat in the back, and we would bounce around, and I think it's pretty amazing that somebody didn't get hurt at some point or other. But we would sing at the top of our lungs, and you know, we didn't have to be quiet there because we were out in the open air. One time, Grandpa took us out for the sheep shearing at the Walks Ranch. And that road out to their ranch had some really big potholes in it. One time we hit one and we bounced up so high our heads hit the cab. And when we got out to the ranch and watched them, they put those little bands on the lamb's tails so that those tails would drop off later. And I thought that was an awful mean thing to do. And we would supposedly help with the sheep shearing, but mostly I think we were just playing. And at one point, we even rode horses, but I had short legs then too. I never got over that. And so I was scared to death to ride that horse. I still don't know how I got up on it, but I got up and I rode it for just a little bit, and I have never ridden a horse again, and I have no desire to. So I can say at least once in my life I rode a horse. Another time Grandpa took us to go see Rusty. He was out actually herding sheep at some place. And I believe he had a camper on the back of his truck. It wasn't a real sheep herder's wagon, but it was fun to get to go out there and see where he was working and to get to see him in that situation and spend time with him and Grandpa both.
We have now moved into the dining room area of the house. This is where, when we came to visit, we took most of our meals because there were so many of us when we were all here. In this area where we have the tables now, we had a large oval table. It was actually a 60-inch round table that had leaves that you put into it, and when you put all of the leaves into it, it would extend from about where this one ends almost to the archway where Bruce is sitting with the camera. It's a really big table. It's now in my dining room, and we like it very much. You can seat as many people really as you need around it. In the area over here, there were two doors. One went into the bathroom. There was one bathroom on this floor and one upstairs. But there was a bathroom right here, and then over there was a door to the kitchen, which is where Grandma did all her fantastic cooking. Because the house had an old coal-fired furnace at that time, and in some of the shots I'm sure you can see the radiators, so it pressed steam heat up through the house, but it was still cold on the second floor, so there was a vent to allow heat to rise because of the high ceilings into the second floor. And Grandma would come in and she would cook breakfast, and then she would go stand under that vent and yell upstairs that it was time for breakfast and you needed to come now. So it was in the middle of the second floor hallway, so everybody could hear it. It was like the world's first intercom system. I remember in this spot where the cowboy poster's hanging now, there was a thermometer mirror from somewhere. I don't remember where.
Sinclair.
Sinclair Oil. It went with the gas station. I remember that. But it had a topless Indian princess shooting a bow into the air. And, well, that was almost as good as reading National Geographic.
At breakfast, there was always a radio playing, and the radio kind of served as a background, but it was important in those days. What you heard on the radio were the hog reports, the cattle prices, or the feed, whether it had gone up or down. This was very important for the ranchers and farmers to hear those prices, because they could decide what they could do about selling the feed that they had on hand, or whether it was a good time to buy hogs or whatever. And this was absolutely, you got used to hearing it. What are the current hog prices? Oh, we'd know right away because we'd heard them that morning. We would also hear the railroad manifest. So which trains were running and who was called to be on them, and this was local work, of course, and so it was very important that everybody heard what was going on. Grandma Fryer would always have a good meal on the table, no matter how early we were up to go fishing or hunting or anything that had to be done, or that we were enjoying doing, as a matter of fact. She would always have this breakfast ready. I remember that a friend of mine came to go hunting with us one year when I was in high school. No, I was later when I was in college. And he was astounded that we had such a civilized approach to going hunting, that we actually had a full breakfast before we went in the field. She wouldn't sit down. She absolutely wouldn't sit down until everybody was served. In fact, most of the time, she wouldn't eat breakfast with the rest of us. She would have breakfast by herself. And you had to be sure that you had enough, because she would invariably ask, you know, if you wanted seconds or thirds or whatever, and she would say, make out your dinner now, make out your breakfast now, make out your lunch now, whatever was being served at that point. And this became a mantra of sorts. Make out your breakfast now.
Grandma would always cook in her cast iron stove, and after she prepared the meal, and after the meal was done, she would burn the trash in the stove, which I just thought was wild. But she would always have your vegetables, she would always have your meat and your potato or whatever, and for dessert you would always get fruit. She had the wildest dishes. They were wonderful. They were all glass, and they had glass lids. And she could take a can of fruit and open it up and put it in one of those glass bowls, and you felt like you were just on top of the world, because you had this wonderful, wonderful set of peaches to eat.
My memories of being in this house, of course, include a lot of meals around these tables, and Clara wandering around, as everybody said. For me in particular, she took me out in the pickup to the school section and taught me where the chokecherry bushes were. But more than even the chokecherry bushes and where they were, she said, this is how you pick them. You pick 1/3 for you. You pick 1/3 for your neighbor who's going to come after you. You leave 1/3. And then you leave the third for the bears. So there was something there about being aware of the context in which you lived. You lived with the animals, which we saw every day, all the time. And then now even there are deer that wander into the yard and take naps during the day. The chokecherries were then turned into chokecherry syrup. I have that recipe. Or they were syrup if you didn't make gel out of it. And you tried for jelly, and if you failed, you got syrup, and everybody liked the syrup better anyway. So you failed a lot if you could. On hunting mornings, we would come down. She would have called up through the grate. You could be smelling the bacon cooking through the grate. And as Chuck was talking about, we would come down, and not only would you have that breakfast packed, but there would be these big green steel thermoses packed with coffee, hot water for cocoa or tea, sandwiches, just in case you got hungry. Because you see, you always go out really early to go hunting, so that's when the animals are up. And you go out there and you have that, and maybe you stay out and you have a little lunch, then you come back. We're going to talk more about hunting later. But in terms of the memories of it, it was Clara in the kitchen bustling around, serving us pancakes and bacon, and getting this lunch ready to go hunting. One of Clara's famous and favorite meals was chicken and noodles, and she would fix this stewed chicken, and in the juices there would be these noodles, and they were long and fat. And I would say to her, well, what kind of noodles are these? Can you give me this recipe? She says, they're just Grandma's noodles. And I thought, well, she's just not going to give me this recipe. So I'd ask again the next time, and this went on for quite a little while. And she'd get this silly little grin on her face, and she'd say they're just Grandma's noodles. And one time, she left the package out. The name of the package was Grandma's Noodles, and she was buying these noodles in these square packages and dumping them into the stewed thing. This was her idea of a joke. It was very funny, actually.
And they were good noodles.
Right, they were good.
In our memories of this dining room, you can't have them without going into the kitchen and the big stove and all of that sort of thing. And then of course there's this beautiful pantry that was oh, at least a block long when I was younger. It was a block long. It was a great place, had wonderful, the china was in it, and it was just a great thing and a very important part of this house. And we were talking about the lights yesterday, that there was just a single bulb. When they finally got electricity into the house, there was a single bulb and you would pull the chain. And today it has a light fixture. So things have changed, but they are still the same.
We have always selected a house when it had a pantry or something that could be a pantry. That would be an asset. A rental property or a house to buy would be upped if it had something that could be a pantry, or as indeed was a pantry, because we had a very fond memory of this one.
And at lunch, we can't forget that the radio was always on, like it was at breakfast, but it was always on. And at noon, of course, you had to sit down in time for Paul Harvey, news and comment. And he would always finish with the rest of the story. But it was a great thing. It was a great thing, and my grandparents always listened to Paul Harvey.
I also remember about Paul Harvey that my other grandmother, my mother's mother, used to listen to Paul Harvey at noon at our house every day as well. And it tended to drive my father a little crazy. He got to the point where he would mock Paul Harvey regularly. But he didn't do that up here.
No. One of the things we did in the evenings was play cards and games. Some different games, some cribbage, some kismet, kids games, and just cards. And my grandmother, that must be where all of us got our competitive spirit, and certainly where my father did. If she lost a hand, even one, she would tell you all about it, and it always included the word chicken chin. Chicken chin, you chicken chin. And she just, it was so funny to hear this little lady, saying these things. But boy, she would get mad at Grandpa when he beat her. And we really had a good time when we would play games and cards.
Well, and she was quite a proper lady most of the time. She did not like to lose at cards at all.
Nope.
And I used to just laugh when she'd call me chicken shit. It was fun. In canasta, she taught us to play canasta, we learned pitch, we learned poker.
And
we learned all kinds of games.
And we all did that. Because playing cards was such an important thing for them to relax in the evening doing. We all had a chance to do that. Singly and as a bunch of kids running around. Now that basically was a way for her to get us to calm down and get ready for bed.
Get ready for bed.
Grandpa had a special ability in playing poker, a special affinity for playing poker. And he basically taught all of us to play poker, and my young brothers as well. He taught them to play poker, and my own kids, he taught them to play poker. And they all have fond memories of doing this. One of my jobs when I was in high school was cleaning the Oddfellows Hall and sweeping it out. And the reason it needed to be cleaned is because the men had all played poker over the Saturday of that week. And they all smoked, of course. And although they were pretty good about maintaining the cleanliness standards, it had to be swept out. And so that was my job. And I did that, I don't know, for a couple of years, I think. But it gave me a real insight into the poker culture of Saratoga. These men got together on the weekend, drank a lot of beer, and smoked a lot of cigarettes in Temperillas, of course, and played poker.
The men did the poker and the drinking thing, and the women went to the churches and did their handwork and sewing, and I'm sure what they were doing mostly was gossiping about the men. But it was all, the women and men had separate social circles back then, and they weren't dependent upon each other for their existence, really. The women did their handiwork and the men played cards.
One of my memories of coming up here when we were first married was to get acquainted with Grandpa, and we'd sit in the evening after dinner in the living room, and he would be in his chair, and we would play cards and watch TV and chat. He'd smoke his Tipperella.
Grandpa really, really loved the show All in the Family because he thought Archie Bunker was a great philosopher and probably had all of the answers to the universe. He didn't quite get that Archie Bunker was a parody, but it was humorous.
Grandma resembled the grandma on Beverly Hillbillies when she'd come out and wave and do that stuff. But she loved that show, never missed it. But she was really like Granny in the Beverly Hillbillies sometimes. It was a hoot.
I was thinking about Clara in terms of what she wore. She would always wear black. She always kept her hair dyed red. You know, she had a variety of really beautiful dresses, but they were always black. And then she had these shoes that were thick and wide and had holes cut in some of them, the ones she'd wear around here, because she had bunions. Do you remember that?
Yep,
Yeah.
and the bunion pads went everywhere.
And she'd put her feet up when we were playing cards sometimes, and we would,
Yeah.
just to take the pressure off of that. So it's neat.
One of the things we always did was go fishing, and Grandpa would take us fishing. Now, he had been a guide in this area, and he knew everybody. And so as I watched the no trespassing signs go by and posted signs, I would get nervous because it said, you know, I pictured people running out and shooting at us, but no one ever came. So later I found out that he probably knew everyone and had permission to do that hunting and fishing. The fishing, though, was great. We'd always go in the Chickadee. He always had a Chevy pickup truck called the Chickadee. And there was a long line of Chickadees, but we always thought it was the same truck till we got a little bit older. But we would sit, George and I would usually sit in the back of the truck, and that's where we rode, was in the back of the truck. We'd never make it today because today they would say that was so unsafe, and it probably was, but Carol would ride in the front seat and sometimes Daddy would go, but I remember a lot of times with just Grandpa. And George and I, when we go out along the little dirt roads out here, we would start singing because that's how we passed the time. And we always started with Rawhide. There's only twice that I remember I got to come up by myself to Saratoga. And Grandpa was still taking me fishing. I know that I think he always enjoyed taking us fishing. I didn't like to bait my hook. Eventually, as I got older, I liked to, well, I didn't like to, but I got to where I would clean my own fish. But this one time when I came by myself, Grandma bought me Red Chief or Red Indian or something, Red Man. It was like a cherry Coke. And oh, it tasted, I don't know what it, I don't think they even make it anymore, but it tasted so good. It was wonderful. And Doritos, the original Doritos, had just come out. So that tells you how old this was. But I got to drinking that cherry Coke and eating those Doritos. I was sick for 36 hours as I ate all of them. Of course, I always did eat too much, but that was quite a treat. But Grandpa didn't have to go fishing that next morning because I was sick.
So I never took to fishing the way George and Vicki did. Instead, hunting was the thing that Grandpa Fryer taught me about. So the first thing he did when I was very small, he bought me a BB rifle. And it was very important that I had this BB rifle because I remember I shot a bird. And I got the biggest chewing out for having shot a songbird with this BB rifle. And it took me a long time to earn back, I believed, earn back the respect of Grandpa Fryer, because this was absolutely forbidden. And this was an important object lesson for a little kid, learning what is respect for the nature of things, to treat hunting as a harvest instead of just for sport. And this became a central idea that I still very strongly adhere to. That there are lots of trophy hunters in the world, but they don't get my respect in this older day, especially. The first rifle that I ever had was given to me one Christmas by Grandma and Grandpa Fryer, and I was so proud of the fact that it was a gallery rifle exactly like Grandpa's was. So it was a visible hammer, and this was important on learning how to shoot properly. And both Grandpa Fryer and my stepfather, Frank Francis, took me to lessons on how to shoot. And at the gun club, there would be lessons on how to breathe properly when you're getting ready to shoot, how to hold your breath when you're firing. These are things that are natural to me now, but were very difficult to learn when I was that age. Then some years later, Grandma and Grandpa got me my first hunting rifle, which was a .32 Special Winchester. They would have gotten a 30-30, I think, but Grandpa got some kind of special deal where he was buying the rifle. And this was a rifle that I still have. And it was an important rifle because it's the one that my wife Lola shot her foot with when she
I'll tell
was
that
on the
story. That's all right.
trip. Yeah. I think my first deer was harvested when I was out with Frank Francis. He also worked with me on hunting, and I think that was where my first deer. But Grandpa, I had cleaned and carried deer for all of his hunting trips, and so I knew exactly how to treat an animal from the many trips that I had taken on the hunting trips with Grandpa Fryer.
I also got to come up hunting a couple of times when I was younger. I remember my dad bought me a 30-30 hunting rifle also. It's a Model 94 Winchester. It's unfortunately post-1964, so it's not worth anything anymore, but I still have that rifle as well. And so came up here hunting on you could hunt when you were 14 and be licensed, so we came up in the fall of my 14th year, and boy, Grandpa sure knew how to put you into the deer. There were always deer where he took us, and I remember at some point my father and his former law partner Jim Williams and I were in the pickup with Grandpa, and Chuck and Lola were driving around. We went up on the sheep rocks to the north of town, and they were driving an old Volkswagen van at the time. I had always suspected they were hippies, and it certainly confirmed that for me. But they went everywhere in that Volkswagen van that Grandpa went in the four-wheel drive pickup. It just puttered along just fine and had enough clearance to go everywhere they needed to go. I did manage to kill a deer the first year. It took a while, but we got one. And you know, I haven't hunted in quite a while now, but it's still fond memories that I have of all the times up here. Again, that was a thing where Grandpa knew everybody and could get you into places where lots of people couldn't go. And we really had a good time with that, and that was the boys' trip. We didn't bring girls or mom on that trip. It was just my dad and me and his former law partner, and we came up here, and the hunting breakfasts were, we would have the full breakfast and everything and still be out of here an hour or two before sunup and be sitting somewhere waiting for deer to come by when the sun came up. And they always did.
You know, I'm having a memory of Joe Williams. I'd forgotten about it entirely. But I was still not hunting a lot. And Jim Williams shot a deer. I was a teenager with football muscles at that time, of course. And I loaded his deer on my back after he killed it. And I carried it down through several draws and back to where the pickup was. Because Grandpa couldn't drive the pickup there. And Jim commented on that incessantly, because here was this kid who had loaded his deer on his back and brought it home.
From the time that I was very small, when Dad would make his trips back out to Wyoming to go deer hunting, he would oftentimes take me with him. And of course I had to sit in the front seat still because my motion sickness started really young. And he used to like to bring Jim Williams with him from Dodge City. And I think that there were a couple of reasons that he did that. I don't know if Vicki and George thought that it was some kind of special child privilege, but I think that it was mostly because he knew that it was hard for Mom to keep up with all these stair-step children. And so even when there was just George, and then of course later when there was Vicki too, it gave her a little bit of a break to have one less child running around the house while he was gone. And then it also gave Grandma a chance to see her first girl grandchild. So I think all of that played into it. And it was a lot of fun to be there and to enjoy all of that. But of course we slept upstairs, and it really bothered me when I would go upstairs at night because Grandpa had those deer antlers hanging right there in the hallway, and they scared me. And so I would rush up the stairs and go to my bedroom and try to get in there as quickly as I could so that nothing could get me. Well, that fear was only reinforced when one time on one of those trips, when I realized what was going on, they brought back the kill and they were cleaning it and everything else in the shed that was out in the back lot. And I saw them doing some of that, and of course there were more deer antlers out there. And to top it all off, there was that big, tall fire escape on the back side of the house. And to me, it was huge because I was just a little girl. And so I knew that those deer were still down there in that shed instead of being hauled off to the meat processing plant, where I didn't understand that part of the process because I didn't see them do it. And so from then on, even more, whenever I went to bed or got ready to be upstairs by myself, especially at night, I rushed where I was going and I'd stomp and run up those steps, and then I'd shut the door because I didn't want those deer to come up that back stairway and get me in the night.
So I come from a family where my father hunted. My mother didn't, but she'd grown up with it and understood it and utilized the meat that came home all the days of my childhood. So when I got married to Chuck, he bought me 30-06 Remington, and it was going to be my gun, and I would shoot it. And he took me out, and I was really a very good shot. And he was very impressed with how fast I learned and what happened when I would put the bullets right through the middle of the target. So then what would happen is that we would be going actually hunting. Now, even though my dad hunted, it wasn't the same as the way Chuck grew up because the guns were not a daily part of our lives. So I could maybe hit the target very well, but what I couldn't do was have the natural understanding of when you loaded the gun, when you carried it, how you did it. There's a lot to that, a lot more than there is to putting the bullet through the target. So in this particular moment, George is driving the pickup, Charles is on the outside so he can get out and take the first shot, and I'm in the middle. Intelligently at least, my gun was pointing downward when he, yes?
We saw some deer.
Oh yes.
And we all chambered around, and you levered the action on the rifle, and then the deer went around the hill, and we got back in the pickup to ride over there, and that's when you carefully...
You got out, and you were standing to the right of the pickup, and you were getting ready to shoot. And Grandpa said, "Get out, you're going to get a shot too." And I pick it up, and I pick it up by the trigger, and I shoot my toe. Now, we get out, and everybody's shocked, and Grandpa, there's a little tiny pinhole in the bottom of that pickup, which was there till the day they sold it. And I'm just, I think I'm fine. Go ahead, and the deer, of course, have disappeared forever. So we load in, because Grandpa's going to take me to the doctor. He knows that I'm dying or something. We start back to town. We're driving by Walks Ranch, and just before we get there, I start to cry. And Grandpa says, "Does it hurt? Does it hurt?" And I said, "No. Frankie's gonna tease me. I shot my toe." That's what I was upset about, because the toe, of course, was in shock. There wasn't any pain yet. We get to Walks Ranch, and Grandpa and I and Chuck see these deer sitting out there. And he says, "Charles, you get out there. You get 2 deer, tag one of them for Lola. I'll take her into the doctor. I'll come back and get you." And that's what they did. So we had our 2 deer that we needed for the winter. I went to the doctor. Dr. Corbett cleaned it up. He was a family doctor in the great old tradition. Then he sent me home to Clara, to this house. And Clara knew I was coming. She had a cup of tea ready for me. She laid me down in the living room on this long couch that was in there with these silken embroidered Chinese cushions. And I drank this tea, and she said, now just tell me all about that. So I told her. She found it very funny. Then she went away, and the codeine pills took over. And I had this vision of being out on the prairie running. And I was running and running, and this white buffalo came up over the hill. And I looked in her eyes, and her eyes were full of the constellations of the night sky. So when Clara came back in to see how I was doing, I told her this dream, this vision. She says, yes, you see, you're one of us. And that was the end of it, but it's one of the proudest moments of my life. Yeah.
So,
I don't think I told you this, Lola. So here I am dressing those deer in the field, and Gene walks field, and he's a close friend of Grandpa's. They had done many
Yeah, they played canasta every Sunday together.
did prospecting together, trap beaver together. So Gene Watt comes bouncing up in his pickup and is ready to lay me out because, of course, he didn't know who I was. I'd grown since the last time I saw him at all, and so he started saying, get off my land, these are my deer, etc., etc. Then I said, no, George Fryer, you know him, and calm down, it's all good.
Put in the genealogy.
Right. So finally he did, and then he helped me, of course. Finished these deer, cleaning them, and we were all set to load when Grandpa came back.
so George has that memory about Christmas when we saw the crutches in all these pictures.
The crutches, oh no.
Whose crutches?
Yours.
We were thinking it was yours.
My crutches.
Were you still
Yeah, we
on
have a
crutches
lot
at
of pictures
Christmas?
from, we came up that same Christmas.
Oh yeah, oh God.
And
Well, this is good.
had
Let's get
family
this.
Christmas here at the house, and we had all kinds of things. We went up on the range and cut a Christmas tree, and it looked like Charlie Brown's. But in all of the pictures, as we reviewed them for the project a couple of years ago, we kept seeing these crutches showing up, and Judy kept saying, well, I don't think I was on crutches. Whose crutches are those? And Lola took one look and said, those were my crutches. That's the year I shot my foot.
So Clara's old upright piano is very important to this house. She needed the piano because she played well enough that she was a person who played to accompany silent movies back a long time ago. And that was when actually, I think, was it Grandpa Fryer and she who owned the theater? Was it?
They did for a while, yeah.
Okay, well, that was important because she was that good. She was really good enough to play for the support of silent movies. So when they moved to this house, this house and the house next door, which the Verplankes lived in, and we called the Verplanke house, both of them were made similarly out of brick back when Saratoga was quite young. And they both had bay windows this house had one too. But Grandma, when she moved in, wanted her piano, and the piano wouldn't fit through any of the doors because they were all too narrow for this, even for the upright piano. So she had that bay window removed so that it could be brought into the house, and then it became a wall behind the piano, a brick wall behind the piano, where the piano sat, of course, for, well, until they had moved on and were no longer with us, and we moved the piano out of the house. When Grandma was paying for my piano lessons in Laramie, much later on, she would drive me to Laramie to take these lessons. And of course she drove in all weathers, and I didn't appreciate it, how much she was sacrificing for me, because she not only paid for the lessons, but paid for the trip, and then braved all this weather, which in Wyoming is various and dangerous sometimes. And we would have the most interesting conversation to and from Laramie to take these lessons. Sometimes, never really serious, mostly humorous kinds of exchanges about the family and what was going on. She, in these later years, never played for me, and I realized that she was embarrassed about the arthritis that had set into her hands, and what she didn't realize herself is that playing the piano would have kept them more flexible. She did, of course, do her needlework and crocheting with her hands, and that helped a little with that dexterity. But the piano playing, if she kept up, would have been even better. When she passed on, we inherited all the music, and it was mostly totally worthless because it had been so used in the years that she was playing that it was tattered, dog-eared, and probably also from the days that she was a pianist for the theater and the silent movies.
I've seen this music. It's been at my house, this box of music that they inherited, and we've looked through it, and I've spent some time looking at that music, and there's notes on the music about I played this for some organization, or when she should play it, or she plays after, like if it's for a wedding. There's little notes on the music that tells where she played, so I'm believing that she played for lots of social organizations and for weddings and receptions and other occasions when music would be required.
When I was about a teenager, I guess, we had no entertainment except a record player which we danced to a lot, because there was a couple of bands in the area, and they would bring music once in a long while, but if we wanted to have a dance, usually it was to a record player. And we learned all the dances, folk dances especially, and had dances at the Fireman's Hall. And the whole community would come, and we would have a great time. We had lessons, several weeks of lessons, when especially the kids learned all the dances, polkas and square dances and Spanish dances like that. Spanish dances anyway. And what I'm thinking of is that we learned the Scottish as well, which is Scottish is just another way of spelling Scottish. It's from southern Norway and northern Scotland, and it was a beautiful dance because very easy to learn, especially for a youngster who was just learning to handle his body. But in a Scottish, it's very similar to a polka, the difference being that the couple stands facing away and they go back and forth to the music and then do a little turning under the arm and around and then back and forth just that way. And looks very complex, but it's really quite simple. Great fun. And we would have these dances. Everybody would dance the Scottish. We would have these dances like every month or so, because otherwise we were bored with the whumming wind.
They always had a black Chevy for years and years and years, even up until the very day she died. The thing I remember about Clara and the black Chevy is it was a Bel Air, and she was a very small woman. She had to sit either on a phone book or on a pillow to see over the dash, and she would sit on that pillow, drive with her hands at 10 and 2, looking over the dash but under the top of the steering wheel. Because even with the pillow, she wasn't tall enough to look through the normal vision area of the windshield. I remember a few times when we were growing up, my father would substitute preach at the Presbyterian church that we went to, and Grandma always wanted to be there. So I remember several occasions she drove from Saratoga, got there in time to hear him preach, then she would tell him, "Good job," give him a hug and a kiss, hop back in her car and head back the 8 hours to Saratoga. It was always amazed me that she didn't bother to stay for a day or two, but I don't think she wanted George to be alone up here. So that was one thing she did. I remember one particular Sunday when the time changed to daylight savings on that weekend, and she got there right at the end of the service, and still she went up, gave him a hug and a kiss, said see you later, and off she went. And Grandma and Grandpa, they always, with those Chevys, ended up giving them to people when they were done with them and getting a new one. I know Chuck and Lola got one, and after Grandma and Grandpa had both passed, I ended up getting the last one. They were quite the old cars and built like a brick. And often she didn't even have a radio in them or anything because she didn't want to be distracted. I remember a story she told me once about driving one of the older black Chevys over the Snowy Range, and the roads in in and around this area are quite washboardy when they're dirt roads. And she had seen a black cat run across in front of her just as she was leaving town. And then on the washboards, when she got out into the country, she proceeded to lose control and rolled the car. And I had seen, the reason it came up is because a black cat crossed in front of us. She stopped the car, turned around and went the other way. So she believed the superstition is what she told me. And I always thought that was interesting.
Over the years, Dad was the substitute preacher at our church, especially in Liberal. And Grandma came at least once that I remember, and she hopped in that old Buick and she drove all the way to Liberal, watched the sermon, and then drove right back. She didn't even stay for dinner, but she wanted to be there to support him in that. And so when I got in college and I was going to summer school at Emporia, and then I went my first year there at Kansas State Teachers College, I got up one time in the middle of the night so that I could be home to listen to his sermon too, and followed her example. I still have that notebook of sermons.
One of the Chevys that they owned after we were married, after Lola and I were married, they gave us, and it was a great car. And it ran for about 6 months, and then had a major engine fixed that needed to be done, and it was way too expensive for us on our tiny little budget. And we drove Volkswagen buses almost forever, and the reason, of course, was that I could work on them. They were very simple engines. I did actually change the transaxle on one time, but the Chevy I couldn't do anything with. It was totally impossible for me to work on. So we parked it, and it was an embarrassment because we didn't want to get rid of it because it had been a gift from George and Clara. So I don't know, it was years later, finally, I think we sold it, but we sold it for a song because we basically, at that point, it was worth practically nothing, and we couldn't acknowledge the fact to George that we had done that with his precious gift.
On this whole idea of cars and traveling, I'd also like to bring up the story of Dad and how he had to test out every car he ever bought. I don't know if once they had kids, if they ever had a totally new car, but he definitely had to take them out in the countryside and drive them. And most of the time he didn't take us with him, but he would always take them out to see how fast they could go. And more than once he came home with a ticket. But the point of it was that was a ritual, and if you got a new car, you had to try it out.
By all accounts, Clara was a little ball of fire. She was very opinionated. She was quite a person, and I enjoyed her and liked her being that little ball of fire. It wasn't until later in my childhood that I realized there might be some traits that somebody might not like. And I know that she had always been afraid of me. I mean, Carol was the favorite, of course. And that was the way it went, you know. Carol was the favorite. And that was because when I was little, very little, like 2, I don't know if I told this story today or not, but we had Thanksgiving, and Grandma and Grandpa came down for Thanksgiving, and
Down where?
down to wherever we were. It was probably Dodge City.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dodge City. But we had turkey, and they were taking the meat off the turkey, and I guess I was more like Clara than I thought. But anyway, she watched me for a while, and I got so angry because they kept saying, no, you can't have any turkey, you can't have any turkey, not right off the bone. And I got so angry that I held my breath. And I held my breath until I turned blue. And then I quit breathing. And then they packed me in the car and took me to the hospital, where the emergency room physician put a needle in my head. I don't know why, but anyway, that scared Grandma, and she was always a little afraid to be alone with me. They always came down on their way. They came down through Liberal on their way through to Florida or Arizona or wherever they were going that year. And I remember it was Easter, and we always ran out to the car the minute they'd get there. We'd run to the car and hug them and all of that, and we hadn't seen them for a while. And Grandma looks at me and she says, "My, you've gained weight." And of course I'm just, well, how can you tell that? Well, I can tell by your face, by your cheeks. So I ran around for the next 2 days like this, thinking I would look thinner. And then I thought about it and thought, well, this isn't going to make any difference today, so we'll just not worry about it. But I wasn't sure how I felt about that. And it was when we started this project later that I realized that, of course, we always had the weight thing going on in the family. And Grandma had been quite heavy, and she had lost a lot of her weight, and she wasn't trying to hurt me by saying that. She was just trying to, it was probably just an off-the-cuff comment, but she didn't want me to repeat her mistakes. And I didn't realize that until we started this project, that was probably what was going on.
When I came into this family, I recognized Clara because she was so similar to my own grandmother, Little Ann, feisty and tough. And George was different than my grandfather, but they had this in common. They were hardworking men, and they were honest, and they were very true to who they were. They were themselves completely. And I could see that George and Clara didn't get along all that time. They had little squabbles. They had them right in front of us. They would argue about cards. They would argue about serious things. Clara did not like his drinking. He didn't like some of the things about her. He didn't like a couple of her friends very well. And none of those things mattered to the core of who they were. And that was similar to my own grandparents. They gave me this model of how you did not have to give in, be right, do everything the same, that you could be independent, individual people and love each other very deeply and get along for a very long time. So I appreciated that about them and still do.
My reflections are more on George. I got to know him when George and I were first married, and it was early on in our marriage. We hadn't been married, but I don't think we had children. So before we'd been married 3 years, and Billy was very quiet and shy, and he was kind of hard to get acquainted with, and yet in the evening, he and I often ended up sitting in that room together, not knowing really what to say to each other. But we got acquainted through cards, and he smoked a cigarette and watched some TV. And we just kind of gradually got acquainted. I know he was gone during the day and came home from the bar in the evening, and he'd be here to visit with us a little bit and play cards. But it was interesting at the end, before he died, we were here. We were here. I visited him a lot in the hospital. He went to the VA hospital in Denver, and Nancy would have to come home and do some stuff here. And so while he was there, I went to visit him 2 or 3 times by myself, and sometimes George and I'd go after George would get home from work. It was kind of like my job to go visit Grandpa in the hospital. So we got acquainted there, and somehow we were here. I don't exactly know why we were here, but I remember that he gave me this speech about how much he loved me, and he valued his chance to get acquainted with me and whatever, and then he killed himself. So he was telling me goodbye, but I didn't know that at the time.
The main intervention that George and Clara made into my life was when I first went to college. I had a girlfriend, and we were quite serious, and were thinking about getting married at one point. And George and Clara intervened because they could see that this young frip of a thing was not really worthy of me and my intellectual abilities. I didn't see that, of course, because I was enamored with this girl. And so they intervened several times, and Clara really made it clear that this was not a good thing to do. And George, actually what he said was something about how much Clara loved me. And it was rather startling to think about a grandparent really loving you. And so that made me stop and reflect that this girl was really being opportunistic, and that I really needed to think about some other possibilities, and one of which later became my living wife, Lola Wilcox. And this was all because George and Clara intervened and kept me from making a teenage mistake. And I'm forever grateful for that intervention.
The latest memory I have, really, of George and Clara together was we came up one summer shortly before Grandma died, and it was common practice for them to go out and take a ride in the pickup on Sundays, or just to go out and tour the back roads and see what was going on, although neither one were as sturdy as they had once been. But I remember them saying that somehow the pickup had broken down, and George was not able to go for help for whatever reason. But Grandma took off and walked 2 or 3 miles to get them help and to get them back to town. And she and George were both very proud of her and the fact that she had been able to do that and basically rescue them from their dire straits that they were in. And your grandma was, mid to late 80s at the time? I don't know, but she was really proud of herself for doing that. And it was shortly after that she had the stroke and passed away, but Grandpa just bragged on her as well.
Well, it's worth bragging on.
I know, it was an amazing feat for a small woman.
She was walking all that distance in a long black skirt, in shoes that were
not designed to walk.
Totally uncomfortable. they looked the way she wanted them to look, but they had heels on them like this, I think, and they caused bunions, you know, the little cutouts for her bunions, so they were, good grief, walking 2 blocks would have been excruciating. So walking 2 miles or whatever she walked.
Whatever it was, but it was an amazing fact, and they were, like I say, they were both very proud of the fact that she'd been able to do that.
For good reason.
Yep.
He went on those trips at night out to look at the animals often, at least once a week, if not every night sometimes. Part of that's to look at Wyoming and the skies at sunset. That's when all the animals were out, and they'd talk.
Right.
It's great.
My grandparents were quite role models, not that they were these perfect people or anything like that, but they loved each other, and you could tell they loved each other. My parents, their marriage reflected a lot of what my grandparents did, how they understood each other. And those examples are what have carried me through my marriage. You know, things aren't always going to be rosy. Things aren't always going to be perfect. And it's what you see from them and how they got through tough times that sustains us now. And that it's okay, that everything's going to be okay.
Grandma's end was very interesting because she had the stroke and then she went in the hospital where she died. My memory is one time when we were in the hospital waiting, because it took quite a lot of time for this to work itself out. We were outside the room at one point. Grandpa was standing at a window looking out with a sad expression on his face, because the prognosis was that Clara would not survive. And I walked up just to be with him for a little bit, and he said, "You know, I always thought I would go first." And it was very significant because we none of us at that point knew what Grandpa's end was going to be, but it was like a real eye-opener that George had really expected that he would be the first to go, and Clara would then follow him.
I wasn't invited to come on that trip to come up and be with Grandpa while Grandma was in the hospital and dying, but the piece of lore I received from my father was that Grandma had been downstairs tending to the coal-fed furnace, and that she had had her stroke while she was down there, and that then they scooped her up and took her to the hospital to see what could be done, which was nothing. But the thing that my father reported, Grandpa had said to him early on while they were waiting to see, is, if she can just get better enough to come home, then I can take care of her, because she's taken care of me for so long. And of course that didn't play out. But then a few years later, when Grandpa decided he was done with the cancer treatments and he would rather die at home than die in the VA hospital in Denver, he went down by the furnace in the same place, and that's where he took his own life, was to in the same very area where she had collapsed with her stroke. So that's the piece of family lore that I got, that always occurred to me that that showed how much Grandpa loved Grandma, is that, he, not only a matter of not messing up the rest of the house, but it was a question of, he chose to do the deed in the same general area where she had collapsed.
There's a piece of that also in that moment. She was in a coma from then on, and it was 2 weeks in the hospital at that point. And when Grandpa said this thing to Chuck about, I always thought I would die first, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. I think that I can go on. Then she passed away within minutes after that, because it was almost as if she were listening, waiting to be sure he would be okay.